Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Bailey Dickey. I lead networks here at GGV, and I'm excited to welcome you all to our 6th annual Evolving Enterprise. This year, we're hosting a series of 7 masterclasses. This is 6 of 7 on different top-of-mind topics for CEOs and functional leaders. We have our final series next Wednesday from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Pacific, April 13th on customer success. If you haven't already, you can view upcoming masterclasses and RSVP via the link I'll drop in the chat. We want to, as always, thank Silicon Valley Bank for their continued partnership on Evolving Enterprise and for helping make this series happen. I'm really excited to turn it over to Graham from here at Team GGV to kick things off. All you, Graham.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Bailey. My name is Graham Carney. I am an investor on our investment team focusing on enterprise and, among other things, PLG and product-led growth companies. And so I brought my good friend Badrul, who was the first PM at Figma, to help us talk about PLG today. So I guess why don't you intro yourself and share your background?
Great, yeah, thanks for having me. Hi everyone, my name is Badrul. I currently live in New York City. I began my career as a QA engineer at a few different companies and a startup. And then in 2016, I started at Figma before the product was public. And at Figma, I worked on the core design tool, and then I helped launch the third-party developer platform plugins, and then the designer community called Figma Community, which is embedded in the product. After Figma, I spent some time at Square working on onboarding, which is more of a growth role, and trying to introduce merchants to the Square ecosystem.
Okay, awesome. So we'll just dive in, I guess. So let's start by defining product-led growth for folks who aren't familiar. So product-led growth, otherwise known as PLG. So it's an end-user focused growth model that relies on the product itself as the primary driver of customer acquisition, conversion, expansion, and spend. So basically, rather than interacting with like sales and marketing, like a lot of other software tools do, the end user finds the product, uses it, let's say, hopefully they derive some kind of value from it quickly, then grow the usage and the spend over time. So some examples of really prominent companies that have really killed the PLG motion and just crushed it are like Slack, Zoom, Calendly, Dropbox, and then the latest, probably most prominent example is Figma. So who better to have here than you to talk about Figma? So let's dive in. We'll have questions that people sent in advance, and then just drop questions you have in the chat, fire away, and we'll get through as much as we can. So I guess let's start at the top. So how did you get your job at Figma? Like, how did you find it? What kind of stage were they at that point? What was that process like?
Yeah, that's great. So in 2016, I was working at a startup that was about 150 or 200 or so. So it's a medium-sized startup that had gotten some traction, and I wanted to go even earlier, both for the product's lifecycle as well as the company side. So I was looking for a very small team and a product that hadn't launched yet. And Figma met those attributes. I actually found Figma through a friend in Venture who just introduced me to them. And then over the course of a few weeks, I got to know the team. And then I really loved the team. And that's ultimately why I decided to join at that point. And then also, I always had a strong love of design, and working on a creative tool is like super fun. Is one of the most fun things you can ever work on. So I thought that was a cool opportunity at that time. So that's how I found them. It was about the summer of 2016, and it was great, obviously.
And that was they were Series B or at that point, maybe?
I think at that point it was post Series A, definitely before the Series B.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool. And did they even have like the concept of PLG back then? Like, what was the PLG journey at Figma? Had they kind of started to nail that? Was that even anything on anyone's mind back then?
I think I heard the first time I heard of the term PLG was only like not that long ago, maybe 18 months ago. So at that time, no one used that term there. The first couple of years at Figma, we were focused on what ultimately ends up being core principles of a PLG motion, but we didn't do it under that umbrella term. And that is basically everyone there. When I joined, we were all focused on building the core product experience to make sure it's just an amazing experience for designers, that it delivered a lot of value. And it was really memorable, especially at that time. We were trying to push the needle on what you can do in the browser. So it was a pretty new and somewhat risky experience for designers. in addition to that, there was also easy onboarding experiences, very fast, very simple. You could easily invite other teammates so you can have an experience with the other teammates so the product can grow quickly within your organization. And those are the two main things we were focused on for quite some time. And part of that is because monetization came even later after launch. So at the beginning, those two basic things, or three basic things, the core product, very fast onboarding, and the ability to invite other teammates so the product can grow within our organization. We were all focused on that. And then I don't know if they use PLGs yet, but even by the time I left, it was not really a term that we used, though the principles are all still pretty sound.
Okay, awesome. And were you at that point, like, were they focusing on just acquiring designers? Because obviously one of the main value props of Figma is helping non-designers, collaborate in the process. Were you selling to or trying to onboard or focused on like developers or marketing folks as user types at that point, or was it just like design?
Yeah, we were pretty laser focused only on designers for a very long time, and that's largely because the tools that people use, especially designers and engineers as well, but designers, is quite personal to them, and there's not enough. No one else can tell a designer which tool to use, so we had to make sure that designers were happy, and then use them as the focal point to be able to grow within an organization. I think the real focus, we had some features that worked well with others, but we didn't really invest heavily in those experiences until a couple of years later, until we knew that designers are actually very happy with our tool. And only then were we able to start seeing that they would help us spread the tool within the organization.
Got it. So focus on like the core designer persona and then make sure they're really happy and then kind of spread from there.
Yeah, exactly.
Sweet. So you were the product lead for Figma Community. So that's the platform for designers to connect like with the design community broadly. So can you tell us about that product, like how you guys got started on it, what the genesis of that was?
Yeah, so the Figma community came after several years of working with the design community in general. So it was kind of a realization in the product of a lot of work we did for years. And what I mean by that is one of the things we did well at the beginning was we really tried to work with members of the design community, make sure they were happy, make sure they're engaged very early. We were responsive to their feedback for the product very early on. We hosted events. We made sure that they felt special. Many ways you can do that is by giving people early access to features so they feel like they have a close bond with your company. And it was quite authentic. I mean, the CEO, all the leaders, everyone would be engaging with the community. And what eventually happened is a few years in, like the community became large. They were quite enthusiastic about Figma, both online and in some events that we had and large conferences we started having. And the insight for Figma community is we wanted to capture that engagement and try to bring it inside the product. Right? There was finally enough, momentum outside of the product. And Figma community is basically a way for designers to represent themselves and their work, share what they're working on, both plugins and design files, and also find inspiration from all the other designers that use Figma. It's embedded within the product for easy discoverability. And we found that it's a great way to scale up the amount of templates and starter material that you can find when you design. You can get over the empty canvas problem, which is a huge creative block for anyone really. So it ends up solving several problems for us over time.
Awesome. And how did that scale over time? Like, how did you think about that?
Yeah, so when we started it, everything was manual. So it was a private product experience. The profiles that I created was manually, I created for them. I would help them publish their files. I would review files for any inappropriate content. And over time, the scaling basically became such that you can do each of these activities on your own without any involvement of us. Meaning you can create a profile, you can merge profiles, you can publish files on your own, you can find other people's files and search, and you can do all of this on your own from day one. So it took about a year or so of privately building with this. Again, we built with the community, and such that when we launched, this community helped us really grow it. So I think that's how we got to the initial launch. And then from there, the scaling became more about being responsive to people's problems or new experiences that they wanted. Because by the time we launched, everything you could do was self-serve, but it took about a year to get there.
Okay, about a year. Very cool. Like zooming out to talk about community more broadly, like what do you think is the best way to start and build a community, and how did you apply some of those principles while you were building one at and within Figma?
Yeah. Yeah. So the main thing about a community, I would say, the hardest thing is that it just takes time. It's like any other community people may belong to. For example, a religious community takes a long time to grow. Online communities obviously grow much faster. So one, I would just have patience. Just generally, it does not grow 0 to 1 in 1 year. I think two, for Figma, and I think this would work for other companies as well, is it was a pretty big company priority. And what I mean by that is everyone was engaged with the community in different kinds of ways and would be the best representatives of the company as we worked with designers. So this included the CEO. He would talk to designers all the time. The director of product would get interesting ideas. Customer support, they were both representatives of the company, and they helped engage designers and brought them closer to the product. And as a result of this, I think people could really get a sense that it was quite authentic and genuine, and it wasn't just a marketing exercise. They felt that they actually had they had close contact with us. They believed us when we said we were going to do things. We made mistakes, and then we would have to apologize to them, and that built trust as well. So eventually what you have to do is these small things, it's very hard to scale this. And as you scale, you still have to invest people into it. And I would say the last thing is that one of the risk factors for all these communities are people are pretty perceptive, and they can tell when you're not being genuine, or you can tell when it's just like a quick hack to grow users, and they'll quickly churn. So I wouldn't. This is not community is a high value, high risk endeavor that I think takes a long time and a lot of investment. So I wouldn't. I would treat it very seriously.
Totally. And on that note, like, how did you go about incorporating community feedback into the product? Like, was it ever, I'm sure it was confusing at some times, like, were there pieces of feedback you didn't want to act on? I'm sure it was, you were probably getting a lot, like kind of drinking from a fire hose there.
Yeah. I would say at the beginning, I mean, Figma had a long way to go. So at the beginning, like every complaint, every request was all legitimate. And today they're still probably all legitimate. It ultimately came down to what we had the ability to actually do and the resources. And I think, we had a full picture over what people are asking for us, right? We had requests from the community, we had requests from large customers. And one of the challenges I think of community feedback is they see only their specific set of requests, and they don't see the full picture. So there is quite a bit of work to do to understand which of their requests are the most important ones, the most urgent ones. One of the challenges I would say is when you don't do things that they want, eventually they will get angry. So you do have to kind of keep engaging with them and engage with community and make sure that they understand that you will get to things. For example, Figma just launched right to left text, which supports huge communities around the world. And that's been a long time coming. And you kind of have to acknowledge that people were frustrated, and they did that. So I think these kinds of things make it okay to not ship things that are hugely in demand at one moment. I think also when we do ship things, we give a lot of credit to people in the community who really were quite loud about wanting certain features. So they feel really heard. Ultimately, you're very accountable to the community, positively and negatively. So I would caution anyone making commitments they're not willing to actually follow through on. So we didn't do that. We didn't say we were going to do something and not do it.
That is smart. Always good to do that. Cool. How did you learn how to do this? Did you just figure this out? Like you as a person, then kind of Figma as an org, like, did you just figure it out as you went along?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I got very lucky. Figma had a great team. They gave me quite a bit of bandwidth to learn from a lot of the people around me. I think specifically for me, we had a great design team, and I was working on a design tool, so I was able to spend a lot of time with them. Yep. I think the other thing that we did really well is every single person did a lot of customer support, and customer support is like the fastest way to learn about a tool, because you have to understand the problem before you can even help someone solve it. So for the first year or so, I ran customer support along with the rest of the team, and that helped me learn quite a bit about the product and how to really empathize with our customers and learn about what it is they need and what it is that we don't have. So, I think, I credit the team mostly for my ability to learn. And then eventually we hired like senior product leaders, and that was also like a pretty huge boon to my growth at Figma.
Awesome. And so aside from kind of learning in the weeds, what did you use? Did you leverage any resources like, I don't know, books, podcasts, like any individuals? Did you leverage any of that to become an effective PM for you guys in your PLG product?
Yeah, so I mean, as an effective PM, there's quite a few resources out there. I think there's like Lenny's newsletter. I think there's a lot of product leaders you can find. I would say I learned a lot from my coworkers. That's probably like the main source of my learning. They're pretty generous. I think in terms of resources for community, there's this book called Get Together, published by Strike Press, which I think is a pretty interesting framework for how to build and scale a community authentically. Again, it's not a get rich quick scheme. It's like pretty slow and deliberate. And I personally think it's a pretty great book. And then for growth, I like a lot of the things I learned from Reforge. I think they have a lot of, they have a lot of free content, but even their paid content is taught by other practitioners, people who've helped build and scale companies. So I find their stuff like very easy to resonate with and very relevant to today's challenges of building a product.
Awesome. Okay. Very cool. So like part nature, part nurture then.
Yeah.
Cool.
There's a lot of failures in between. So I learned a lot from that as well.
But you got there. That's what matters. So like, how did you, in the early days, how did you guys think about building PLG into the culture of your org? Like, is there anything specific you did, either in terms of mentality or mindset? Did you hire for a particular kind of way of thinking? Like how did you do that?
Yeah, so I think it was kind of there all from the beginning. A lot of the early hires from Figma ended up coming from Dropbox, which is another success story for the product-led motion story. They grew amazingly well, and they had a very good sales team. In fact, the first sales leader for Figma came from Dropbox. A lot of the early designers came from Dropbox and early engineers. So I would say a lot of the understanding of what it takes to build a company like this was there on its own, and everyone, design, marketing, product engineering, all these functions, they had the same focus and the same demands, which was to product experience and to figure out how to build a product that can actually grow and serve customers' needs. And I think the singular alignment ultimately is what drove the culture of the company, right? If people were not focused on disparate goals, we were all focused on kind of the same goals. So one, I would say that we recruited from certain companies that fit the mold for how Figma wanted to grow. And then I would say there's quite a bit of ongoing perpetual collaboration between product marketing and sales, and product managers. The product team did feel accountable for the revenue growth of the company and things that were barriers for the sales and marketing teams to actually identify good leads or actually close really amazing customers. So it was a pretty shared responsibility. Like these teams didn't operate in silos and have disparate goals. They're pretty intertwined. And the last thing I think is that everyone kind of knew that like a generational business, we really needed both like the self-serve business to grow, but then also the sales team to grow as well. So everyone had the same long-term understanding of what it would take.
Awesome. That makes sense. And we're going to dive into sales because that's a huge part of like the calculus here in a second. But did you have any best practices around product design to unlock PLG? Like any examples or kind of like things to think about there?
Yeah, I would say, the main goal for everyone, I mean, especially the design team, is how can you get your users to the core product to experience the value as fast as they can with almost no friction. So Figma has a very simple onboarding. You simply email, password, maybe your role, and you immediately are into the product and you can sign up and use it very quickly. And that's pretty much our focus. We never introduce barriers, and we actively try to remove as many barriers as possible for people to get started. And everything was focused on that. Even for Figma community, it was what's the fastest way you can start browsing or start creating content, creating your profiles. And I think that's pretty much the core principle for all PLG stuff. It's, if they have to go through a form or if they have to talk to a human, you're going to lose a lot of people in that funnel.
Totally. So just make it like immediately useful, reduce the friction, and then people can figure it out.
Yeah.
Sweet, makes sense to me. So you joined really early. What were some of the challenging parts of your early days, and how did you overcome them?
Yeah, I think Figma has this like nice aura today of like quite a bit of success, and it's fun. It's fun to see that like it's doing really well. I think that's obviously not the case at the beginning because it was just the beginning of the journey, and I don't think it was very obvious that this thing was going to grow successfully and have a lot of love from the design community. So I would say the first few years was just basically the one caveat I'll say is that the design community is special in that they are pretty tech forward and they do try new products. And they are very critical when they don't like products. So we did benefit from the fact that we had a lot of early adopters who were very honest about things they did like and things that they did not like. And I think the hardest thing was basically working for a couple of years to try to make sure these designers are actually happy using this for work, not just as a fun new thing they saw on the internet, some new thing to try. And it took a long time to get different designers on board, and they had slightly different needs also depending on the kind of designers they were, the kind of companies that were done. And then eventually even getting a designer was one barrier. The next barrier was like, can you get their teams to actually sign up? Can their teams actually sign up to pay? And I think that's a little while as well to start seeing that growth happen. So, I think all great startups have like uncertain futures. And I think that uncertainty was pretty challenging for everyone, especially because there are still amazing design tools in the market. So seeing Figma succeed is pretty refreshing in the end, but that was quite a long journey to get there.
Yeah.
Sorry,
go ahead.
I was going to say, I mean, eventually the best part is, the customers helped to design the product. So we ended up building it with them. So it ended up working out for a huge group of people. But it was a lot of persistence, I'd say.
That makes sense. You mentioned the market and like other design tools. So like when you were there, it wasn't at all obvious that like Figma was going to be the kind of breakout there, and there were other ones like Sketch, like InVision. How did you on the product team think about how to basically beat them in this market?
Yeah, well, I think design tools are interesting in so far as the table stakes features are very, very long. So there's multiple ways to think about it. One, the amount of work it takes just to get table stakes features is pretty much non-negotiable, right? There are certain features you simply can't work with. So a lot of it was just having a long enough runway just to make it interesting enough for anyone to even give a serious look at. And by serious, I mean at work on mission critical work, right? It took a long time to get there. I think we also had a belief that design was going to be far more important in the future than it is today within organizations, and that everyone would want to be part of the design experience. And that's kind of what shaped the multiplayer experience of it, the amount of collaboration features that we invested into it. And I think that really helped us differentiate from some of the other tools that are also pretty great, but it was a pretty good differentiator compared to Sketch and InVision, which had different models for how they believed collaboration should work, and the kinds of people that might want to be involved in the design process. And it was a pretty simple insight. It just took a long time to actually execute on.
Speaking of building certain elements, so like how did you, because you just referenced this, like how difficult is it to build PLG elements into like a top-down product? Do you think it's a cultural thing and it's sort of in your company's DNA, you can't shift it, or it's like an aspect of the product or the end user that's hard to pull off, or do you think it's potentially possible?
Yeah, I certainly think it's possible. The longer you're a top-down product, it's probably a little bit harder to go or introduce product-led motion. Ultimately, I think if you already have a top-down motion product, it's kind of a culture change and an expectation shift for everyone inside the organization, right? In a top-down product, different teams may work in silos. They may not collaborate as closely. They may not think about the user journey the same way. And the culture change would be that we're all accountable, product, marketing, and sales, to build a user journey in the product that can grow very quickly, where you can identify the leads through product usage, where you're all kind of accountable for different kinds of revenue metrics, and ultimately you end up collaborating a lot more. I think you end up focusing sales and marketing and product on leads that you can determine from the product rather than from outbound or paid marketing or any other source that you traditionally got your leads from. And then ultimately the growth product team or the team that's focused on sign up all the way to paid ends up being quite empowered in this new organization to make whatever changes they need to make the PLG motion work. That's not always true in a top-down company, but I certainly believe it's possible. It is a mentality shift on how you're going to drive value for your customers.
Totally. So I promised to talk about sales. This is actually a good segue to that, thinking about top down and sales. So to take like a more philosophical approach, do you think that PLG and sales efforts support one another? Do you think they're opposite by definition, or neither of those?
Yeah, I would say the core thing is that most of the most successful and generational businesses have both. They have both sales and PLG, and part of that is everyone's motivated by building the biggest business possible. So if you're focused on that, building the biggest business possible, you should be much more open-minded to having a product-led motion, or if you're a product-led growth company, to also have sales. And there are many things that sales can do that a product-led growth company can't do. For example, you can work with customers that are not sold on your product. They're not convinced that it's going to be good enough. Maybe they're not interested. They might need more guidance. And sales teams are really good at getting those customers to be bought in and signed as paying customers. And then even for customers that onboarded into a product and paid through a product-led motion, you can always touch base with them. You can cross-sell, you can upsell, you can also support those companies and help them continue growing, even organically. So I think sales teams are extremely useful, and you just can't build an amazing business without a great sales team. And then for the product-led motion growth, I think it's here to stay. It's end users are becoming more and more empowered in these organizations. They have buying power. And if you're a strong sales team, you'll want those employees and those small teams or even big teams to sign up for the product and drive growth for the business. Ultimately, it's going to help the sales team focus on more strategic customers as well over time.
Totally. How did you guys layer on the sales motion? Like, you had a really strong PLG. I think Figma took a while to do direct, like, enterprise sort of style, and I guess SMB sales, but you really had the PLG motion going and were bottoms up for many years before sales. So how did that work from your vantage point?
Yeah, so Figma introduced their enterprise tier in 2019. And that's just when we announced it. So it took time for that to even ramp up. We hired our first sales leader, Kyle Parrish, in the second half of 2018. So we already knew that we were going to target eventually an enterprise, and we wanted a sales motion. I think one of the things he did really well, and the sales team at Figma does really well, is at the beginning, they really heavily focused on the strategic customers that we needed that likely would not have converted on a product-led growth or like a self-serve motion. So they focused on strategic customers. They focused on the largest contracts. And then in many cases, they also helped existing customers take the leap and become some of our largest and most effective enterprise customers. Ultimately, I think in a company that has a good product-led motion and you introduce a sales team, the sales team ends up being much more engaged. It's a lot more intellectually challenging to work with strategic customers that are not easily convinced that your product is the right one for them, and they have more demands and more requests before they're willing to sign up. So it worked out really well for us, and the sales team is just continuing to grow, and they're a core part of, I would even say, the success of our product-led motion. We learned a lot faster with that team at Figma.
Awesome. And just for folks who aren't aware, Figma was founded in 2012, and so if they started sales 6-7 years in, that's a while. A lot of top-down companies are starting that from maybe not the beginning, but certainly earlier than that. And so it's a very unique, interesting take on how to grow product. But clearly, they started with a really strong PLG motion, and then were able to layer sales successfully on top of it past a certain threshold. I always think that's really interesting about Figma because it's such a long runway to do a sales motion. Very unique. Do you think as the company has matured, and do you think the PLG motion has changed at all, basically as Figma became more enterprise and has done more of the sales, made that 2019 leap that way?
Yeah, I would say, I would echo one of the things I just said. I think ultimately we learned a lot more, a lot faster. One of the things that is difficult in very successful product-led motion is that a lot of people, they'll sign up, they'll trial the product, they'll start paying for it, and they'll start using it. And if you do this in enough volume, at least for the product team, for myself, it's hard to learn from each of these customers and what makes them different. Are all their needs being met? Are they running into problems that we can't determine? So the sales team helped us pretty systematically understand who the biggest customers are, what their specific needs and problems are, and where our product gaps really are. So we learned a lot faster with them, and it improved our product-led motion. It improved our sales motion, of course, and obviously it improved the product experience itself. And then we also became much more rigorous about understanding which customers were receptive to our self-serve experience. Even if they signed up, you can kind of tell some of them weren't actually fully happy with it. They still had several questions. And then which customers, we saw some usage for them, but they never made the leap to a paid customer. So it helped us determine the differences between different kinds of customers and which ones, the product experience is just not the right one for them.
Yep.
And then, ultimately, I think, as we've thought about the kind of company that Figma wants to be, or many of these companies want to be like Dropbox, like Atlassian, where they want to have an amazing sales team and an amazing product-led motion. Ultimately, the introduction of the sales team, it just helped us work a lot better and just have a better and more sophisticated view of the different kinds of customers we aspire to serve and how, they have many similarities. They're quite different. Their demands are different. Their expectations for how they engage with the company is different. And as a result, we worked better together and we were able to build, I think, the product experience itself became better once the sales team really grew at Figma.
Awesome. PLG plus sales gone very right. What other kind of sales-led enterprise companies have you seen incorporate PLG into their platforms?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of companies are starting out of the gate with aspirations to do both today. But I think, I think Zoom is probably one of the best success stories. They launched in 2011, and my understanding is that they introduced self-serve in 2015. And I think I'm sure many people on the call also know this, but yeah, we started using Figma all self-serve, and then they grew dramatically during COVID, of course, because they had the self-serve and product-led growth motion available. So I think Zoom is probably one of the most unique stories in that they introduced it 4 to 5 years after their founding. And then also, I'm sure it was quite a big culture shift, but they were able to do it pretty successfully.
Awesome. And Zoom also has crushed it, both from PLG and from a sales perspective too. What are some reasons people were asking, like, what are some reasons not to use PLG from a product, I guess from both a product and a market or go-to-market perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, PLG is not a panacea, so it definitely doesn't make sense for a lot of different kinds of companies. So I would say, like, one, if the end user itself themselves do not have buying power or significant influence on buying power, so there are many industries where this is not true. Technology employees a lot of them do have buying power, but for example, in certain healthcare industries, certain high finance or hedge funds and things like that, the end user is not really the one who's going to be able to decide whether or not they should use a new software product. So that's if you're targeting those kinds of customers, it might not be the best use of your time and resources to build a great product experience to onboard and pay. And then I would say there are a lot of customers outside of buying power who are not typically excited about doing everything online. They're much more comfortable talking to a sales team. They're much more likely to convert talking to a sales team. And in those circumstances, you kind of really have to think about your ROI on whether or not a PLG motion will actually result in people paying, right? Some people just genuinely want to be sold to successfully, and there's sales teams who do a really great job at doing that. And then finally, there's two other kinds. If your product, just due to the simple nature of what it is, requires a lot of initial setup, maybe through your sales team, maybe through customer success teams, et cetera, PLG is probably not going to be the thing that works anyway, because it requires a lot of setup to get going. And there are companies that are successful like this. It's just a different kind of product experience. For Figma and for Notion and for Zoom, you can just sign up and you get ready to go. And some products are not like that. And then lastly, if your contracts are super expensive, millions, potentially tens of millions, high ACVs, people want to touch base with a human to build trust before they sign over a ton of money. So in all those cases, people have a lot of anxiety. Their jobs are on the line, so they will only sign up if they had a sales team. So there's many reasons not to do it. It's certainly not a guarantee for a successful business. I think you have to be really thoughtful about whether or not your customers would be receptive to this, or your product's the right one, where introducing PLG is actually going to make a difference to your business.
Yep, totally. Those high ACVs definitely want a lot of like support, especially not just like the beginning sale, but like you have to have them like a customer support motion built out and everything to retain those folks. Versus self-serve, like not so much. I guess the last question that we have is, how does it feel to see PLG kind of become this thing, like this part of the zeitgeist in a way that it really wasn't when you were starting out, and to see it from the vantage point of somebody who was very early at kind of what seems to be the defining example of that these days?
Yeah, well, I have two reactions. One, I think it's a little surreal because we never use this term. We were just focused on building amazing experiences for people.
Yeah.
With that said, I do think it is, as it becomes more intellectualized and like people understand the pros and the cons of it, it does create an interesting way to think about how you can scalably grow a business if you have the right kind of product. And I think it unlocks a lot of growth. I think my own experiences using software is actually pretty good because PLG is taking off, meaning I can just sign up and use everything, and I rarely have to have a lot of friction for talking to people. So I think in the long run, it's going to be great. I think in the short run, as people figure out the pros and cons of it, it's a little surreal, I would say.
That's cool. Well, awesome. I think that was it. So I think we should wrap up. Badrul and everyone in the audience, thank you so much for coming to the PLG session at Evolving Enterprise. Thanks very much. Bailey, do we just wrap?
Yeah, you're good to go. I think you had a little bit of a freeze out there, Graham. Hopefully that was just on my end, but
okay.
No, thank you everyone, and we appreciate. There'll be a recap, and you can rewatch this as many times as you want, so be on the lookout.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye everyone.